Guten Abend und herzlich willkommen. Für einige hier im Saal ist das jetzt schon die zweite Runde. Wir hatten heute Vormittag bis in den Nachmittag hinein schon einen Workshop mit Gästen aus Israel, Palästina und einigen Expertinnen und Experten hier aus der Bundesrepublik und der Europäischen Union zum gleichen Thema, das wir heute Abend jetzt in einer öffentlichen Veranstaltung diskutieren. Es war zumindest schreckenweise doch ein Brainstorming, welche Lehren aus diesen 20 Jahren zu ziehen sind seit dem Oslo-Abkommen und welche Auswege aus der aktuellen Sackgasse der israelisch-palästinensischen Beziehungen zu finden sind und eines Friedensprozesses, der kaum seinen Namen verdient. Und ich hoffe sehr, dass die Veranstaltung heute Abend von einem ähnlichen Geist geprägt sein wird, eines kritischen Dialogs, aber eben einer konstruktiven Suche nach gemeinsamen Auswegen, jenseits der üblichen Schuldzuweisungen und auch der vermeintlichen Besserwisserei, die man oft bei uns in solchen Diskussionen findet, wo wir so tun, als wüssten wir ganz genau, wo es langgehen muss im Nahen Osten. Diese 20 Jahre Oslo-Abkommen scheinen ein sehr langer Zeitraum zu sein, und das konnte man auch heute tagsüber spüren in unserer Diskussion. Vor allem auf der Seite der Palästinenserinnen und Palästinenser wächst die Ungeduld, es wächst die Erbitterung, der Zorn über eine demütigende Situation von fortgesetzter Besatzung und verweigerter Selbstbestimmung. Und gleichzeitig sind 20 Jahre kein sehr langer Zeitraum für Konflikte mit so tiefen historischen Wurzeln und so vielen unterschiedlichen Facetten. Konflikt um Territorium, aber auch sehr gegensätzliche historische Narrative, religiöse Elemente, die in diesem Konflikt eine Rolle spielen. Und wenn wir nach Europa schauen, dann haben wir einige eingefrorene Konflikte, die zum Teil noch älter sind und waren bisher nicht in der Lage, als europäische Gemeinschaft darauf eine politische Lösung zu finden. Vom Bergkarabach-Konflikt zwischen Armenien und Aserbaidschan über den Zypern-Konflikt bis nach Bosnien und in den Kosovo. Und das ist kein Argument dafür, nichts zu tun und abzuwarten, aber vielleicht doch ein Argument dafür, mit einer entsprechenden Vorsicht an diese Konflikte heranzugehen und alles zu tun, um eine politische Umgebung zu schaffen, eine politische Dynamik von Vertrauensbildung, von Zusammenarbeit, die in der Lage ist, dann auch die finalen Fragen zu lösen, die mit einem israelisch-palästinensischen Friedensschluss verbunden sind. Oslo war bei aller Frustration über den Nicht-Friedensprozess, der dann daraus gefolgt ist, doch ein historisches Ereignis. Rabin hat damals zu Arafat gesagt: Wir, die wir gegeneinander gekämpft haben, wir sagen heute zu euch, den Palästinensern, genug Blut, genug Tränen. Das war mehr als doch eine symbolische gegenseitige Anerkennung, aber es war eben keine Verständigung über einen Friedensvertrag. Und tatsächlich, das war heute auch tagsüber Thema, hat es nur 2 ernsthafte Anläufe gegeben in diesen 20 Jahren, nämlich die Verhandlungen von Camp David im Jahr 2000 und dann die Initiative des damaligen israelischen Ministerpräsidenten Olmert im Jahr 2008. Und man kann unterschiedlicher Meinung sein, das ist ja auch umstritten, woran letztlich diese Initiativen gescheitert sind, ob es tatsächlich nur kleine Restdifferenzen waren oder ob es eben doch fundamentale Gegensätze immer noch gibt, obwohl wir alle zu wissen glauben, wie die Blaupause einer politischen Übereinkunft aussieht, die berühmten Clinton-Parameters oder die Entwurf eines Friedensabkommens der Genfer Initiative. Aber Fakt ist, dass beide Seiten bis heute nicht in der Lage waren, sich über die kritischen Fragen wirklich zu verständigen, die künftigen Grenzen, den Status von Jerusalem, die Frage eines Rückkehrrechts für palästinensische Flüchtlinge, Sicherheitsfragen, die mit einem solchen Abkommen verbunden sein müssen. Und es ist doch sehr fraglich, ob sie jetzt in den aktuellen Verhandlungen, die unter mehr oder weniger sanftem Druck der Amerikaner zustande gekommen sind, dazu in der Lage sein werden. Das heißt nicht, das war auch eine Lektion der heutigen Diskussion, dass damit eine Zwei-Staaten-Lösung vom Tisch wäre, auch wenn es viele Stimmen gibt, die sagen, das verwandelt sich zunehmend in eine Fata Morgana, in eine Illusion. Und Zeit ist natürlich ein kritischer Faktor. Wenn der Siedlungsbau fortgesetzt wird, dann schwinden schlicht die territorialen Voraussetzungen für eine Zwei-Staaten-Lösung oder zumindest werden die Hürden immer höher. Aber es lohnt sich dennoch, darüber nachzudenken, ob es möglicherweise alternative Wege zu einer Zwei-Staaten-Lösung gibt und ob man sich diese Zwei-Staaten-Lösung vielleicht auch auf eine andere Weise vorstellen kann, als das üblich der Fall ist, nämlich nicht in einer Logik einer möglichst kompletten Trennung, sondern in einer stärker kooperativen Logik. Also Israel und Palästina zu denken als einen gemeinsamen politisch-geografisch-historischen Raum für zwei Völker und zwei Staaten, die auf vielen Gebieten eng miteinander kooperieren, ökonomisch, wenn es um Bildung und Wissenschaft geht, um das Wasserregime in der Region, sicherheitspolitisch und die gemeinsam auch eingebettet sind in die Nachbarschaftspolitik der Europäischen Union. Das könnte ja auch ein möglicher Anreiz sein von unserer Seite, um eine solche Lösung zu befördern. Die Rolle der internationalen Gemeinschaft ist in einer solchen verfahrenen Situation sicher extrem wichtig. Es ist fraglich, ob beide Seiten aus sich heraus alleine in der Lage sind, die gegenwärtige Blockade zu überwinden. Aber gleichzeitig sollten wir realistisch und bescheiden genug sein, um zu wissen, dass wir eine Lösung nicht erzwingen können und dass wir eine Verhandlungslösung auch nicht ersetzen können, also einen verhandelten Frieden. Allerdings kann und muss die internationale Gemeinschaft mehr Initiative aufbringen und auch mehr Kontinuität, um einen solchen Verhandlungsprozess notfalls auch mit Druck zu bewerkstelligen und auch eine Garantierolle dafür spielen, dass er zu einem fairen Ergebnis führt, nämlich zu einer Zwei-Staaten-Lösung auf der Basis der Grenzen von 67 mit möglicherweise vereinbarten Austausch von Territorien, der den Palästinensern tatsächlich ein Leben in Würde und Selbstbestimmung ermöglicht. Das ist jedenfalls aus meiner sehr subjektiven Sicht so ein vorläufiges Fazit. und ich wünsche allen einen interessanten Abend und übergebe das Wort an Alexandra Senft, die Moderatorin der heutigen Diskussion. Vielen Dank.
Ja, schönen guten Abend. Ich freue mich, dass Sie doch sehr zahlreich gekommen sind, weil das Thema ja doch viele beschäftigt, aber auch viele mit dem Thema manchmal ermüdet sind. Und insofern ist es so schön, wenn sich doch noch sehr viele Menschen dafür interessieren. Und wir haben hier vier sehr interessante Gäste, die ich Ihnen jetzt zunächst einmal vorstellen möchte. Ganz außen ist Nur Ode. Nur lebt zurzeit in Ramallah, wo sie als Medien- und Kommunikationsberaterin tätig ist. Von 2012 bis 2013 war sie die Direktorin des Palästinensischen Medienzentrums und zugleich Sprecherin der Palästinensischen Autonomiebehörde. Und ich glaube, sie war wirklich die jüngste Frau, die jemals diesen Posten innehatte, und zudem auch noch ein Novum, dass sie sogar parteilos Sprecherin geworden ist. Davor hat sie 11 Jahre in Englisch, Spanisch und Arabisch, wie ich mit Interesse hörte, für arabische und internationale Medien über den Nahostkonflikt berichtet. Sie war immer sehr dicht am Geschehen und vor allem auch zu sehr schwierigen Zeiten. Ich denke, auch deshalb hat sie für ihre englische Berichterstattung für Al Jazeera den renommierten Preis Golden Nymph Award auf dem Monte Carlo Film Festival in der Kategorie Bestes Nachrichtenprogramm ausbekommen. Direkt neben mir sitzt Tamar Sandberg. Ich habe gelesen, sie gilt als Rising Star of the Israeli Left. Tamar lebt in Tel Aviv. Sie bezeichnet sich als Feministin und als Aktivistin für soziale und Umweltangelegenheiten. Und sie ist seit diesem Jahr in der Knesset für die Partei Meretz, für die sie zuvor auch im Stadtrat von Tel Aviv-Jaffo gearbeitet hat. Tamar Sandberg ist Politologin und stand bei den sozialen Protesten im Sommer 2011 an vorderster Front, könnte man sagen. Sie setzt sich für einen palästinensischen Staat an der Seite Israels ein und, ich habe gelesen, befürwortet auch den Boykott israelischer Produkte, die in israelischen Siedlungen in den palästinensischen Gebieten produziert werden. Sie ist außerdem auch für Public Transport, für öffentliche Verkehrsmittel zuständig und publiziert relativ regelmäßig auch in Zeitungen und Zeitschriften. Ganz außen rechts sitzt Gilad Shaer, der in Tel Aviv lebt. Er ist von der Profession her Rechtsanwalt und er ist Direktor des INSS, des Center for Applied Negotiations, und außerdem Wissenschaftler am Institute for National Security. Gilad Shaer hat mit Yitzhak Rabin und Ehud Barak zusammengearbeitet und war vor allem von 1999 bis 2001 Unterhändler und stellvertretender Chefunterhändler bei den Camp David und den Taba-Verhandlungen. Er hat zusammen mit dem früheren Chef des Shin Bet, Amy Ayalon, die Bewegung Blue White Future gegründet. Diese zivilgesellschaftliche Bewegung will Israel als jüdischen und als demokratischen Staat erhalten. Und er setzt sich unter anderem auch deshalb für einen palästinensischen Staat an der Seite Israels ein. Zu den Zielen seines Movement gehört der Versuch, zumindest 100.000 israelische Siedler in der Westbank davon zu überzeugen, westlich der grünen Linie, also nach Israel selbst, zurückzuziehen. Zu meiner Rechten sitzt Mouin Rabbani, dessen Familie aus Haifa stammt, wie er mir heute Morgen erzählte. Er selbst ist in den Niederlanden geboren. Er ist ein unabhängiger Wissenschaftler und Publizist und hat an der Tufts und Georgetown University Geschichte, Auslandbeziehungen und die Politik des Nahen und Mittleren Ostens studiert. Von 2002 bis 2008 war er Berater für Palästina in der internationalen Krisengruppe und heute ist er führender Projektleiter für das Nahost- und Nordafrika-Programm der Krisenbewältigungsinitiative CMI in Helsinki. Moin hat mir gesagt, dass er aber seine ganz persönliche Meinung hier vertritt und nicht die des CMI. Ich selber bin Alexandra Senft, ich bin Autorin und Publizistin und schon sehr lange mit dem Thema Nahe und Mittlerer Osten beschäftigt. Das ist einer meiner Schwerpunkte. Mein anderer Schwerpunkt sind die transgenerationellen Weitergaben des Holocaust und des Zweiten Weltkriegs. Themen, die scheinbar nicht zusammengehören, aber doch sehr oft auch zusammen gedacht werden müssen. I'm switching to English now, so I can speak to you directly. I think it's better, yeah. I happened to be in the Gaza Strip in 1993 when the Oslo Accords were signed. And I remember one scene that when everything was broadcasted on television, a lot of people went out into the streets to celebrate. And there were Israeli soldiers who were still in Gaza at the time, and they had to take care that things were not getting out of control. And I will never forget that at some point the crowd was pushing and the soldiers were trying to sort of keep order. And then there were some young Palestinian boys who actually formed a chain to protect the Israeli soldiers from the crowds pushing too much. And they were holding up olive branches. And after all the violence that had gone on before and all the destructiveness, you could say, I thought that was a very moving human gesture at the time. Noor and Tamar, you were teenagers, if I may say so, at the time, I think 15, 17 approximately. Have you any personal memory of the time when these accords were signed, or did it have any impact on your or your family's life? Noor, maybe you want to start?
It seems like it was quite a while back. I was actually in Southeast Asia at the time. And I remember watching the ceremony. And to be honest with you, I had very mixed feeling, but I do remember very clearly feeling a sense of grief. Having seen an agreement being signed that actually puts, engraves, if you will, forever, that concession that Palestinians gave up front in 1988 by accepting the UN Security Council Resolution 242 and by accepting to have a state established on the West Bank and Gaza out of the rest of mandatory Palestine. So it was a mixed feeling. I can't say that I was as jubilant as the crowds that you saw, who I know also, you know, there were famous pictures handing out those flowers to the Israeli soldiers. But I did feel that at least this might give me the chance to see the Palestine that I had always been denied to see, which did happen. So that was one positive outcome. But there was that sense that some part of us as Palestinians, we were letting go of in the hopes that it would bring a better future.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Heinrich-Böll, for the invitation. I actually have a very clear memory of a few months before the accords were signed. I was in Paris, actually. I was 17 years old, graduated from high school, and I had this post-high school vacation with my friends, and I was sitting in Paris in a cafe having a coffee and a croissant, and I see a man across the table holding a newspaper, the open newspaper, so the main headline was headed in front of me, and it said, Arafat to Jerusalem. And I'm like, what? That was it was as if now you would hear that, I don't know, the moon has came down to earth, and I don't know, something like that happened. I was growing up knowing that Arafat is the biggest terrorist, the biggest enemy ever, and having the word Arafat and Jerusalem in the same sentence was unheard of and unthinkable. And shortly after, that was, I believe it was July 1993, and 2 months later, we were watching in the television Prime Minister Rabin and Arafat shaking hands, and then actually the late Prime Minister Rabin was known for his shyness and for the difficulty that he had shaking hands with Arafat, that he was also raised to know as enemy. And there was something very human and very even humble, I would say, in Rabin, and it's a very famous collective memory for Israelis, having his bringing his military and national experience to that moment, and well, probably we will discuss the unfortunate outcomes later this evening, but that was an optimistic moment.
Gilad, you were born 5 years after the creation of the State of Israel.
That's right.
And so if my maths is right, you were about 40 when the Accords were signed, and I assume you have a different perspective on what happened at the time.
Well, slightly different, because I was already quite grown up. But I think that at that point in time, that was exactly 20 years after the Yom Kippur War, in which I fought in the Suez Canal and in Egypt. I realized much before 1993 that military power and violence will not resolve the Israeli-Arab conflict. And I was very hopeful when I've heard the news about the Oslo Agreement, about the negotiations that led to a mutual recognition between Israelis and Palestinians for the first time in history, and that gave some hope for the reconciliation throughout an agreed process of negotiations, from the very principle, the very basic principles of reconciliations throughout an interim period, and then resolving all the core issues: Jerusalem, refugees, statehood, territory, borders, and security. So not much later, I was contacted by a person on behalf of Prime Minister Rabin, asking me if I would like to join the delegation that is being established for the next round of negotiations towards the interim Oslo B agreement, the self-governance, and I did not hesitate for a minute. They told me, you will have to dedicate about a day and a half to 2 days for that per week, which on the very first week of work became a full 24/7. And I did not hesitate to take upon myself this assignment and deal with the security and legal matters related to the interim agreement. I was hopeful then, and I'm hopeful now, despite the fact that the reality is not necessarily broadcasting such hope as it did 20 years ago.
How about you, Martin? You were 29 at the time, and
No, a teenager.
Teenager. Okay.
No, I was in my late 20s. Yeah, I was happened to be spending the summer in Istanbul because I was a doctoral student at the time, trying to master Turkish. And even at such a young age, my initial response to Oslo was I almost had a heart attack. I think what Nur was describing as internalizing the prospect of a two-state settlement, I think that had been pretty much resolved already in the late 1980s with the Palestinian Declaration of Independence, the PLO's acceptance of UN Security Council Resolution 242, recognition of Israel. The problem with Oslo was not that it solidified the alternative of a two-state settlement as opposed to what in Palestinian terms used to be characterized as the total liberation of Palestine. Rather, the problem with Oslo was that it could not lead to a two-state settlement on the basis of the international consensus as it was known then, an international, regional, and Palestinian consensus. Tamar has spoken about the headline. Well, the fact of the matter is Arafat didn't go to Jerusalem, and within the framework of Oslo, he never did go to Jerusalem. Even his corpse didn't make it to Jerusalem. In terms of looking at the situation today, well, if you liked Oslo, you love the current negotiations, because I think it's entirely plausible that they will lead to an agreement that will permanently institutionalize everything that is wrong with the Oslo agreements and take us even further away from the prospect of a durable, just, and lasting, comprehensive Israeli-Palestinian peace. If I can just make one more point. My view of Oslo is that it basically, when the occupation started in 1967, and in the decades after that, Israel pursued a policy basically of enforced integration towards the occupied territories. That began to change in the late 1980s, where for a variety of factors, most prominently the First Intifada, but also structural changes in the Israeli economy, the end of the Cold War, Israel began to pursue a process of separation towards the Palestinians. Now, there's, I think, a fundamental difference between separation and peaceful coexistence. And Oslo is very much in agreement about subordinate separation rather than peaceful coexistence.
When dialogues fail, one often, well, no, let's put it this way. One usually tries to learn from dialogues that were successful, when in fact, I think it is often much more useful to actually analyze why did dialogues fail. I think it is general consent that Oslo was a failed process. However, I would be curious to get your opinion. Is it really also consent why it failed? Or is there disagreement over the reasons? Because this would probably give us a key to the lessons we could learn from the Oslo process.
Well, I think there may be a consensus or agreement among Israelis and Palestinians about some of the reasons why Oslo failed. And one of them is the fact that it was managed terribly, that it did not have a mediator that was actually mediating, and that is the US, and that it was set in such a way, this phased, let's wait and see kind of approach, this sets you up for failure. All of the agreements that were signed, none of them were implemented fully. And in fact, all of the so-called disengagement, whereby little slithers of land were handed over to the Palestinian government for limited control, none of them were fully implemented. So now the Palestinian government has somewhat of a control over less than 20% of the West Bank, while 60% are under complete Israeli control. The remaining is under what is called the mixed control. Pretty much all of the West Bank is under Israeli control, but I'm talking about the ABC reality of Oslo, which is another reason why it was a colossal failure. But I think my perspective is the most important reason why Oslo failed is because it was built on the wrong premise. The premise that this was an agreement between two equals, and it wasn't. It never was, and it won't be, so long as there's an occupying power and an occupied people. So long as there's a supreme military power that is in control of the territory, the airspace, the water resources, the borders, the fate of an entire population in addition to its own, and the people under occupation who really don't have the power or authority over anything that they're talking about. So there is that huge disparity, which Oslo didn't take into account. Add to that a broker that is openly biased, if you will, towards one side, that has on its agenda, on its domestic agenda, unwavering, unconditional support to one side of the conflict, and that is its sovereign right. But if you have that situation as far as policy goes, you can't honestly pretend that you can be, even-handed when it comes to brokering a negotiated settlement between those two parties. When there's a strong and a weaker party, that usually means that you need to be enabling the weaker party in order for it to deliver and in order for it to be able to reach a dignified resolution to this conflict. And this is not a territorial conflict, which I think is another detail, very important detail that got lost in the conversation. We're not talking about a territorial dispute between two states. We're talking about the fate of a nation and its right to self-determination. Those principles, which are enshrined in international law and international human rights law, which are accepted principles for all peoples all around the world, were literally detached from the process, and we're not allowed to be part of the conversation or the discourse, political or otherwise. So it was okay to conduct negotiations so long as we don't touch on that sensitive issue of international law and the fact that there are rights that are supposed to be taken for granted that apply to everybody, including those two sides of the conflict. And in this, I'm talking particularly about Palestinians.
Would you, Tamar and Gilad, relate to that? I mean, would you go along with this analysis?
I agree with not a very large part of this assessment. I agree that there is asymmetry here. Of course, that's the basics of it. But I think that the causes for Oslo not to have provided an agreement until now, and I disagree that it failed. I don't think that it failed. I think that the intentions were quite good, but the implementation was very lousy. And when you start gathering for yourself the violations and the infringement of the other party, then you know that you're on the wrong way, and that's what we did. Actually, Israelis and Palestinians alike, and nobody was there to enforce the implementation of the agreements. Now, when you are not strict in the implementation of the small details and the small obligations of the parties, then you tend to be as much as not strict when you deal with the larger and more significant obligations of the parties, and that's what happened. And basically what we had is a failed implementation process with a very lousy management of the process. We spoke this morning about the 20 years of Oslo since 1993, and we are at 2013 now. But if you ask yourself, when and for how long during these 20 years did we really negotiate permanent peace, end of conflict, finality of claims, the final end game? Well, maybe you can get to 1 year altogether. That's 2000 and 2008. Together combined, you get to 1 year out of 20. So, number one is the implementation style. Second thing is, I believe that there was an asymmetry between the expression of the intention within the two respective societies. While our Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, was assassinated by an Israeli Jew because of his clear expression of his willingness to end the conflict and to walk all the way towards ending the occupation and ending the conflict, I never heard anything like that from Arafat or Abu Mazen, for that matter. So what happened is basically that we negotiated in good faith, and what we got in return was terrorism, violence, hostilities, suicide bombing, etc., etc., etc. I hate to put all the blame on one side because it's not black and white, but it's very much like that when we are negotiating and we have to kind of disregard what happens outside the negotiation room, which is, I agree, occupation with all what it brings with it, but also terrorism, premeditated against civilians. I can't see the symmetry here throughout the process. And last but not least, I believe that there was a need for a supporting coalition of moderate Arab states and Arab leaders for the concessions that Arafat was supposed to make, because he felt very isolated when he had to take any kind of decisions that related to implementing the Oslo Agreement. And there was nobody there to help him take those decisions and support him afterwards. This is something that we have to learn from and to draw lessons from, because if it happens again, we will repeat the same mistakes. And I attach that malfunction to the American brokerage of the Oslo kind of process.
There's no such thing as one Israeli view, as there is not one Palestinian, but many Palestinian views. What do you say, Samar?
I want to make 3 remarks about the failure, and I do agree. Well, you know, you can't argue with the outcome. We're 20 years later, and no Palestinian statehood on the ground, so that means a failure. And the 3 points are connected to each other. The first one, if you ask the Israeli average person what happened there in the Oslo Accords, I think the Yitzhak Rabin assassination is very, very, it stands out, because it happened right in the middle of the 5-year term that the Oslo was supposed, like Oslo it had an expiration date. You know, like cheese, when you buy in the grocery and you take it home and there's a date, after that you can't use it. Oslo was supposed to be like that. It started in 1993 and it was supposed to end in 1999. And Rabin was assassinated in 1995. So that's one thing. But the reason, I think Oslo itself had 2, in retrospect, problematic components. One of them that it actually was an ongoing, and you can say in some way an interim agreement, and that is why the final agreement, like it was later called, was not discussed during the first years, and then a lot of things can happen. People can get assassinated. People can start terrorism as opposition units, and the coalition between moderates, that was the discourse of the 90s, have the extremists on both sides isolated and the moderates on both sides in a mutual coalition. That concept failed, and the extremists on each side were too destructive to the process. And the third, and in that respect, I must agree with both my Palestinian colleagues that, again, in retrospect, I'm sure it was not a bad intention in the beginning, but the division between A, B, and C areas and stating a different status for each and every one of them, the idea was to start handing over control over to Palestinian regime, but the outcome is destructive now, 20 years later, when we see right-wing Israeli government doing anything it can to try and either annex, or annex is not the right word, but try and normalize as much sea area as it can, leaving the A and B under occupation, but as isolated from each other. And actually the reality now in the West Bank, and I'm not talking about the isolation and detachment of the Gaza Strip, but the reality in the West Bank itself is actually deteriorated since. So I am optimistic though, but I guess I would have to leave my, and you asked about the analysis of the failure, so I hate to end the comment with such a bad feeling, but I'll guess we get to the more optimistic outcomes in a short while.
Noor, you have traveled from Ramallah yesterday, and also you reported from the Gaza Strip for 6 years in a row for Al Jazeera, I think. What is the present situation on the ground? Maybe you could give us a few impressions.
Well, let me start with Gaza, because it is under my skin, having lived there for several years, having actually moved there in order to get married to my husband, because he had the misfortune, if you will, of having a Gaza ID. And when we decided to get married, the only place he had to go was nowhere. So I told him that I will travel and come to Gaza, and that we can start our lives there. Gaza right now is an open, living hell, to put it in a nutshell, a place where 1.6 million people live, very vibrant, very young society. The majority are under 35. Some of our brightest and best bloggers, social media activists, young artists are from Gaza. They still live in Gaza despite everything. They live on 18 hours of no electricity. They wait for the announcement of when they will have a few hours of electricity so they can do the laundry and the everything else that modern day life requires. And yet there's this crazy sense of defiance, if you will. It doesn't really make much sense when you live in Gaza day in and day out, when you know that you can't really travel, you can't plan for tomorrow, you can only plan for the next few hours at best. But there is this crazy connection to life, and they hold, you hold on to it when you live in Gaza with as much tenacity as this caging in a reality seems to be so stubborn. You confront it with the same kind of stubbornness to live as normal a life as possible. The West Bank is the flip side of Gaza, not because it's an open space or that there's freedom of movement. It's the exact opposite, only the reality in the West Bank doesn't have those loud explosions. There are no planes now firing bombs into neighborhoods and so on, the way daily reality is in Gaza. There are no clashes anymore with Israeli occupying forces on a day-to-day basis, armed clashes, that is. But in the West Bank, you have several hundred separated realities because of hundreds of Israeli military roadblocks. Villages that are supposed to be part of the same district live completely different realities depending on how close they are to a settlement, for example, or how fortunate they are to be close to a road where Palestinians can travel, so their life is a bit easier. They don't have to figure out a way around the roadblocks and around the settler-only roads and so on. So it's a different reality of siege, if you will. It feels better, it sounds better, it's a lot more quiet, but it is a reality where everything is controlled, where the brands of cheese and milk that you buy in the supermarket are decided by the commercial crossing that is governed by the Israeli soldiers. So when there is a holiday, for example, or when this so-called commercial crossing, which controls the flow of goods from one Palestinian city to another inside the West Bank, when it is closed, for example, I remember not being able to get the soya milk I needed for my son who's lactose intolerant. So it's those kind of details that always remind you that, you know, you live, you drive around, there's electricity, but your reality is nowhere near normal because you're not in control of anything that happens around you.
How much, Gilad, is actually perceived of that among the Israeli public? I remember quite a few years ago an Israeli journalist writing, well, we know London and New York much better than we know Ramallah or Gaza. How conducive would it be to a mutual understanding if the Israeli public actually knew about the details going on, or do they actually know it? What is your assessment?
Well, honestly speaking, nobody is interested in that. There's a few from the left, from the human rights associations and organizations that are concerned with it, and some of the elite thinkers and authors, but the Israeli public is quite indifferent to that. And let me tell you why. Because Israelis have this kind of belief that Israel has done whatever is possible, including making a lot of concessions throughout the years. And what it got back is something that you don't very often see on TV. That's a daily attacks on civilian centers. We left Gaza in 2005. Yes, we left it unilaterally, but still we left it entirely with not a single soldier or civilian Israeli in the Gaza Strip. And what we got back is when Hamas took over Gaza, we got back terrorism and attacks and shelling of rockets and missiles over much of the southern part of Israel. This is not news for you here in Europe. I'm traveling a lot. I'm watching quite a lot of TV reports from the area. Never it has been reported here. So Israelis are kind of fed up with this asymmetric coverage of their reality. I am the first to stand for the end of occupation, and I believe that Israel has done throughout the years several attempts to reaching a final agreement on the permanent status between Israelis and Palestinians, and by that ending the occupation. I agree that the interim agreement with the division between areas A, B, and C is not something that was supposed to be with us 18 years after its signing, at the most 3 years. Tamar made gave this example of the cheese, and you spoke about the soy milk. Well, let's talk about this. How does it look? If you look at the map of the interim agreement, what you see is really something that is impossible to live with friction on every inch between Israelis and Palestinians on a daily basis. So, yes, it is very bad. The situation is not good. But how to change it? Just pursue the dialogue and find ways to end it in a manner that would provide for the two nation states, to be living side by side, the one and the other, and coexist in a in a kind of an amicable divorce without pointing at one another, the blame assignment and finger pointing at one another, who does what to whom, because that does not serve anything. Now, during those 20 years, there were several attempts to resolve that. They did not succeed. It does not mean that we have to give up.
Well, there's always an endless competition between Israelis and Palestinians, who is suffering more in this conflict, who is the victim and who is the victimizer. And I think that is often an obstacle to actually getting down to talking. Moain, after all these endless negotiations in the last 20 years, how do you perceive the political atmosphere in Gaza and the West Bank, especially when it comes to the younger generation? Are they still interested in politics, or are they beginning to go their own way and form maybe something new, like Tamarot I heard about? Maybe you can elaborate a little on that.
Well, I mean, the Palestinian youth in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are becoming increasingly politically active, but I wouldn't characterize it as a movement. They don't seem to be particularly well organized among themselves. They're not yet beginning to assume either leadership positions in the existing political organizations or set up organizations of their own. And so I think it will be a long-term process until we see this today's youth leaders begin to assume positions of political power. I have to say, I mean, if we want to talk about the region a bit, we can spend a very long time talking about the shortcomings and failures and corruption and so on of Fatah and of Hamas, but there is, I think, one important distinction between the Palestinian political system and that of most of the surrounding Arab states, which is that the Palestinian political system retains a level of political legitimacy among its own people. It may be a much smaller level of legitimacy than it previously had, but it does retain a level of legitimacy that makes any kind of external challenge much more difficult than we've seen in some of these surrounding states. So the idea, I think, that you're going to get a youth movement that's going to overthrow Fatah and Hamas and replace them with a third force is not something I see happening.
The Arab Spring didn't affect the
Well,
Palestinian youth?
Of course the Arab Spring affected Palestinian youth, but what I'm saying is that I think the residual legitimacy and staying power of the Palestinian political system is such that it will remain for the foreseeable future a two-party system that's very difficult to challenge and to replace. I think the more worrying development, I mean, if you would have looked at opinion polls in the 1970s or 1980s and asked Palestinians who they support, I think at least 99% would have chosen Fatah or the Popular Front or the Communist Party or whatever. What has happened, particularly since Oslo, is that the fastest growing constituency has been none of the above. And I think today, none of the above is probably a bigger movement, if I can call it that, than either Fatah or Hamas. And I think for a people living under conditions of occupation, like the Palestinians, and requiring mass mobilization and so on, it's a very worrying development, because I think it speaks less about the apathy of the new generation than it does about the political and strategic failure of the existing forces. And this, I think, brings us back again to the broader discussion about Oslo. Is I think one of the most negative consequences of Oslo has been the fragmentation of the Palestinians as a people, both geographically and politically. And we could go on about this. I think there's a basic discussion is I mean, if I understand Gilad correctly, he's saying Oslo was either a sound agreement or an agreement that could have worked properly, but the but the fault was with the implementation, and without assigning blame, the Palestinians made mistakes, the Israelis made mistakes, the American supervisor made mistakes, and if they get it right this time, it can reach a successful conclusion. I think that while it's clear that every party involved in Oslo has violated the agreement and made mistakes and so on, the fundamental problem is the agreement itself, and that ultimately nothing positive can come out of it. I mean, one need only read the agreement. It doesn't mention, for example, either an end to occupation or self-determination or decolonization or statehood and so on. I mean, the only thing it mentions is that the agreement will lead to the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 242 and 338. Well, one doesn't have to be, you know, a world-class political scientist to understand that the Israeli and Palestinian interpretations of 242 and 338 are fundamentally incompatible. At the time of the Begin government, it was, I believe, the official Israeli position that when the last Israeli soldier left the Sinai Peninsula, Israel thereby evacuated more than 90% of the territories that it occupied in 1967 and thereby fulfilled its commitments under 242 and 338. So, you know, 242 and 338 mean nothing if there is neither a binding definition or a binding arbitration mechanism. A, B, and C, well, if you read the original Oslo Agreement, it doesn't mention A, B, or C. It talks about a redeployment of Israeli forces from all the territories. I don't even think it says occupied territories, except for settlements, military bases, and Jerusalem, if I'm not mistaken. A, B, and C was introduced in the Oslo II Agreement in 1995. And again, that's because there was no arbitration or enforcement or any other mechanism. So I think the broader point I'm trying to make is the problem is the agreement itself. Yes, there have been problems of implementation and so on, but those are secondary. And from my point of view, if you understand Oslo properly, it's actually been, unfortunately, an extraordinarily successful agreement rather than a failure.
Tamar, I heard you say you never know when Moin said he doesn't believe there will be an uprising or a youth movement. What were you thinking of when you said that?
I was thinking of July 14, 2011, when I was just finishing some kind of event and going through Twitter and Facebook on my mobile phone and seeing that 2 blocks from where I'm standing in Tel Aviv, there are a growing number of people in the streets in Rothschild Boulevard, which is the main, it's like the Champs-Élysées or the Friedrichstrasse of Tel Aviv. And I was going there just out of curiosity. It was something like midnight or 1 a.m. And what I saw made me realize that I am visioning in front of my eyes what seems like a revolution. And that was the first night of the Israeli social protest or tent protest as it was called, and that was very unpredictable. It was compared to the Arab Spring, to the Occupy movements in the U.S. and to the Spanish and other European uprising movements that were active around the same time. And actually, for me, both personally but also collectively as a political generation and a movement, that was the first moment of the reviving of the new left in Israel. And just a few years before, when I was a left-wing activist, one of a few, you know, that Gilad was just mentioning, a few academic elite and some human rights organizations sitting in offices like the Heinrich-Böll office in Tel Aviv. And is Mark here? talking about what we're gonna do, etc., but deep down knowing that we are few and that no change in government and no political change in the streets of Israel is about to happen in the next, I don't know, 10, 20, or even 50 years. Today, I can tell you with self-confidence that the change of government in Israel is closer than it seems right now, and obviously closer than it seemed prior to 2011. There is now an entire generation that was politicized, that was moved into activism, into politicization with a clear left-wing agenda. Even though I agree that there is still a great indifference about the occupation and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but left-wing agenda is something that has many components, and for me the most important thing is to push these energies and this motivation and this politicization into the political arena, making the point that there is no social justice that stops in the green line, that there is no true equality and justice without ending the Israeli occupation over the Palestinian people, and having solidarity with the right of self-determination of our neighbors. That is something that my people and my nation got. And there is no reason. I represent a generation who are not willing and we don't want to be occupiers. I was born to this reality. I was growing up during the process of trying to change this reality. It failed, and now I'm part of a generation who is pushed into politics, understanding that it's in our hands. Nobody else is gonna do the job for us, and I draw great optimism and energy and enthusiasm from the fact that there is echo to what we do, and there is a growing number of Israelis that are active in so many different frameworks that are actually politicized and affiliated with I don't know, left wing or progressive or whatever you call it agenda. So I'm sure we are now in a process. It's not the peace process. It's a political process of change in Israeli society, and I'm sure it will bring also change in that aspect.
Presently, there are talks going on again, which are supposed to be sort of finalized by the end of next April. Noor, what strategy does Mahmoud Abbas actually have? Does he have a strategy? And also, how does that include or exclude Hamas in the Gaza Strip?
That's a very big question.
They're all big, these questions.
Well, let's start with the easy one. Kerry's efforts. As far as ordinary Palestinians are concerned, and I think one of the constant rules of politics, especially in this conflict, is that the general public is always smarter than the leaders. So I think Palestinians, ordinary Palestinians, understand where this is going, and it's going nowhere. So they've tuned it out. They've tuned it out for two very important reasons, mainly, in my opinion. One is that it ignores the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is not as sterile as Gilad described it. It's not about points of friction. Those points of friction, which we Palestinians call settlements, which are built on mostly privately owned Palestinian land, are increasing. They're growing. They're growing in size. They're growing in number. They're funded directly and indirectly by the Israeli government, this and the previous governments. This is not an exception to the rule. This has been the reality since the beginning of the occupation in 1967. So these settlements that pop up in different neighborhoods on different hills in the West Bank, they take up privately owned land, and the water resources under them. They make movement for the Palestinians who live next by nearly impossible in certain areas, and they devastate the livelihood. So any talk between talking heads like us or politicians and decision makers that ignores this reality and kind of doesn't want to talk about it doesn't mean much to ordinary Palestinians, because it's not going to change their life, it's not going to ease their misery, and it certainly will not promise them a better tomorrow, at the very least a return of the territory that they lost by force. That's one reason. The second reason is Palestinians and Israelis who are committed to this two-state formula are, again, smarter than the politicians and a lot more courageous. They're willing to admit that 20 years of trying the same formula and failing is just not worth trying again. And I think the important thing is to change the premise, to change the rules of this game and the conversation. And this is where I think the international community has failed Palestinians and Israelis. And this is where the Americans have been so reluctant to change. They tried initially they were very shy about it, to talk about settlements. They paid a very high domestic price for that, and then they stopped. And now we're supposed to play nice, Israelis and Palestinians, and talk about peace and how important it's supposed to be, and we're both really, really committed to getting there, but we're just not going to talk about the big issues. And we're not going to talk about settlements. We're going to call them Israeli civilians, because calling them Israeli settlers will just create tension. I think the more and more we fool ourselves into choosing these sterile words to describe the situation, the more we're evading real effort to find a real solution. If we keep escaping and using scapegoats like the blame game, like saying that, oh, you responded to the unilateral exit out of Gaza by terrorism, even though the international community and legal experts agree that Gaza is still under Israeli occupation, full Israeli control of the borders and the airspace and the food that gets in there, then we're avoiding an honest conversation, which is very uncomfortable, but it's the only way to get to a solution. So long as we keep avoiding that honest conversation, I don't think we're anywhere closer. So back to Mr. Kerry. I think he's probably very well-intentioned. He doesn't have much time left, and I don't think he has a B plan, because it's always easier to blame the Palestinians for failing. And for these efforts failing. The Palestinian president, who I think is very courageous in leading his people into this very uncomfortable situation of being engaged in a process that ordinary Palestinians don't think will succeed, has a strategy, and that is to use what he terms the Palestinian soft power, the power of their just cause, to engage positively on the political track, to raise awareness internationally about the just cause of Palestine and the Palestinian people, their right to self-determination, and yes, to prepare to exercise the right to enter into international agreements and to commit, like all other states, to those obligations that we expect all law-abiding states to commit to. The respect of international law, the commitment to the fact that this law has no exceptions, none whatsoever. No state is above the law, no people is above the law, and Palestine is ready to make that commitment, even though it's still under occupation. And I think we will see more and more of that once the Kerry initiative winds down in April or so.
When you say Palestine is ready, you mean both Fatah and Hamas?
Well, look, the reconciliation issue, I think, is very important, although that would require a whole conversation.
Just briefly.
But briefly, as far as negotiations is concerned, and despite the very bitter Hamas Fatah or Hamas PLO divide, which I covered extensively, including the Hamas takeover of Gaza in 2007, the fact of the matter is that Khalid Mash'al, who heads Hamas, has agreed and does admit that the only political entity that is empowered and has the legitimacy to negotiate is the Palestine Liberation Organization. So on the Palestinian side, even though there are very serious disagreements between Fatah and Hamas, and not just Fatah and Hamas, between the secular national liberation movements and a movement like Hamas, and to another extent like Islamic Jihad, the idea that who will be negotiating is not so much a point of real discussion. It's used in the rhetoric of the division, but politically speaking, there is consensus that the PLO, headed by the President Mahmoud Abbas, is the legitimate and sole representative of the Palestinian people. So in that sense, I don't think there is a problem, and in that sense, the international recognition of Palestine also leaves no room for doubt.
Gilad, in 1992, there were about 220,000 settlers in the Palestinian territories. Nowadays, I think it's 550,000. It's gone up immensely. If my figures are right, I think it's only about 6 to 8% of the Israeli population that you would call national religious. However, their representation in the Knesset, and the new Knesset, has gone up quite dramatically from 13 to 20 seats. How strong are they really? I remember an Israeli journalist a long time saying they're the strongest social movement in Israel. Is this exaggerated? And I know that from your movement, the Blue-White Future, you are actually visiting houses of settlers to convince them to relocate to Israel. Do they listen to you? Are they open to this? How do you assess the whole movement?
Well, it's not just the settlements and not just the settlers that provide an obstacle, or that put an obstacle in the way to peace. Of course, I think that any Israeli leader that would bring an agreement, and put it on at the center of the public debate at the Knesset, the government, and the Israeli public, that an agreement that ends the conflict and ends the occupation, and allows for a two-state solution, which is imperative for Israel. And I'm selfish here because I think that that's in the best interest of Israel to have the two-state solution. It will entail, of course, the relocation of settlers. The number is to be determined by the delineation of the boundaries. In past trials, or in past attempts to end the conflict, we had the delineation of the Clinton parameters, if you want, 4 to 6% annexation, and a land swap that compensates for that. It, of course, requires the relocation of dozens of thousands of settlers. In the Olmert proposal, Prime Minister Ehud Olmert's proposal, at the end of the Annapolis process in 2008, there was also a proposal to annex the large settlement blocks, which incorporate about 75 to 80% of the settlers, the largest number, the vast majority of the settlers in the territories and in East Jerusalem, while relocating all the others, subject to having an agreement signed. So, you know, I believe that what we should be looking at in terms of the current process of negotiations is a much more serious process of negotiation, because a negotiation or a kind of a dialogue that Secretary Kerry has put together since July, while the parties have met less than 20 times during that period, with the two delegates from the respective parties. I don't call that negotiations towards resolving the conflict. So I believe that the United States, as well as the international community, should look at intensifying the negotiations first, putting a plan or a scheme or parameters on the table for the parties to deal with, on security, on statehood, on borders, on Jerusalem, on refugees, on water, on everything. And then let's continue the negotiations day in, day out, with the leaders participating, with some framework of international conferences and summits and staff working, because with no process we will have no results. Now, having said that, we can also fail, even if we do that, which we are not currently doing. So I would like to see, in a month's time, not more than this, an American proposal on the table for bridging, in order to bridge the differences between the parties on all issues concerned. And then we need to prepare a plan B, a contingency plan in case of failure, because we failed already. So why won't we fail this time as well? So let's prepare a second plan, which will replace and complement the missing understandings between the parties. And that is to allow the parties to have some constructive steps put into action, and steps that are not negating the two-state solution, but that are getting us closer to a two-state reality. And that relates to the settlements in particular. I believe that if Israel, for instance, stops the construction of, in the settlements eastwards of the security fence and in the Palestinian quarters of East Jerusalem, and allows those settlers who wish to be relocated before an agreement is signed to do so, subject to getting compensation for their assets, and be relocated within Israel proper, they should be allowed to do so. And Israel should have a national scale plan in order to absorb those settlers. This is what we are doing. We are reaching out to those settlers, including the very, very extremist ones, religious and others, and secular and national religious ones. And we are trying to see whether there is a common denominator here within Israelis, within Israeli Jews, to actually relocate settlers in a way that we will have a less traumatic relocation when an agreement is signed. I believe that at the end of the way, when an agreement will be presented, either throughout just a negotiated agreement or with the help of unilateral and independent moves of either Palestinians or Israelis, I believe that such an agreement will get an overwhelming majority vote, both within the Palestinian society and within the Israeli society. And we have to get there. But in order to get there, we have to negotiate seriously and not just artificially creating this kind of notion of negotiations and having this caption of a process of negotiation without having any meaningful content in it. And I'm saying that as an Israeli Jew because I was dealing with these issues for most of the last 20 years from the human rights and civil rights perspective, and from the government perspective, and from the regional perspective. And I believe that for Israel, there's no other way to secure its own values, its national identity values, for being Jewish and democratic at the same time, and respect minorities, and having coexistence of some kind of peaceful coexistence with its neighbors, reaching out to the diaspora, etc., etc. There's no other way but to separate from the Palestinians. So let's put all our efforts into that and help the Americans carry Obama, if he wishes to get hands-on this issue. And we need your help as well. I mean, you Germans and Europeans, we need your help as well. Not only sanctioning, boycotting, punishing, and criticizing, but helping making peace.
When security issues are very much on top of the Israeli agenda, have always been. But in spite of all the weapons on the wall, it seems Israelis are still afraid that the Arabs could be the predecessors, let's put it that way, of the Nazis, who could push them into the sea, who are looking to extinguish them once again as a people. Is this a notion you can empathize with?
Actually, I find the question a little insulting, to be perfectly frank. The idea that somehow the Arabs, an ethnic group, are the successors of the Nazis, which is a political ideology. I mean, I don't quite see how the one fits the other.
Psychological terms now.
Well, you know, psychological terms, if we look at the conflict, you know, in the 50s.
Well, elaborate on it, please. Yes, so fine.
I mean, in the 50s, Nasser was Hitler. You know, in the 70s, Arafat was Hitler. In the 90s, Saddam was Hitler. Then Ahmadinejad was Hitler. So, I mean, at the rhetorical and polemical level, we can have a very uninteresting discussion about this. What I would say is, if one wants to take the security question seriously, ultimately, there's only one, let's say, effective way to achieve security, which is when you have a political agreement on the basis of which people on the other side either no longer have a reason to shoot at you, or that if they do, that they are prevented from doing so. Now, again, I'm not going to get into the whole history here of who was actually pushed where by whom during the last century, at least in our part of the world. But I think the point here is that one people was dispossessed, and in the ensuing decades, a state has been using an institutionalized violence to maintain its control of that people and territory, while the other parties of the dispossessed people have been using violence to seek to reclaim their rights. Now, have human rights violations, massacres, terrorism, all the rest of it been committed? Of course, by all sides, although I would argue disproportionately. But the fundamental issue here is the absence of a historic compromise, is the absence of reconciliation through a peace agreement, is basically, I would say, at root cause the absence of Palestinian self-determination. On the basis, I mean, you have to remove the conflict if you want security. And I think what the Israeli government's position has been, certainly this government, is they are demanding not just security, but absolute and unconditional security, kind of as a precondition for the privilege of negotiating an agreement with them. It flies in the face of logic and reality, in my view.
Let me get back to the issue we discussed earlier on about the asymmetry, the disparity between the two partners, in inverted commas, in the negotiations. How do you really perceive, or let's put it this way, in Oslo, there was mutual recognition of the other. The PLO agreed to the existence of Israel, and Israel said, yes, okay, we agree to the PLO actually representing the Palestinians, which of course touches very vital points of people's identities. However, I wonder how much have both people really recognized each other? Ralph Fuchs said it in the beginning, we have two different narratives here, we have two different religions, we have two different legal systems and different societies. And each denies the other, in a sense. I said it initially, one is the victimizer, the other is the victim. Of course, everybody wants to be the victim. Does one not, in order to actually break the deadlock in negotiations, have to come to some symbolic gestures, which includes the Palestinians acknowledging that Jews had the Shoah and are therefore imprinted on it, and Israelis acknowledging that there was a Nakba and that the Palestinians lost their home and their villages. How important are symbolic gestures in the negotiations, and could this be a different approach rather than talking about moving settlers or not moving settlers and discussing is there going to be one state or two states? There are a lot of discourses and none of them seem to be getting anywhere. Maybe you would like to relate to both.
Actually, I don't really know what to answer to that question. I do agree that the discourse is in two different levels. One is the political level that started in Oslo and then repeated itself in other government and non-government solutions and the proposals that intentionally were about detachment from the narrative and from the history, and trying very rationally to focus on the results and the outcomes of number of settlements, security arrangements, water division, etc. Now, if you ask me as objectively as I can, is that the right way, or should we pick from the very start a different way of going to the narratives first and trying to emerge from there to a political solution? The truthful and honest answer is that I don't know. I don't have the answer. I do know that on the one hand, when I was a teenager during the 90s, we used to have many people-to-people, youth-to-youth meetings, going to Germany, to Cyprus, to Aqaba, meeting Palestinians anywhere but in Israel or in Palestine, trying to work on, at first I remember when I was, 15 maybe, I went on this youth delegation and we had resolutions coming out of the delegation, as if we sit in the UN or in Geneva and writing, and each one of a 15-year-old were very determined to represent his or her government as best as we could, and that of course was ridiculous. And then when I was in the university, when I was a student, I participated in a very interesting workshop led by Professor Dan Bar-On, who wrote his PhD actually here in Germany, focusing on narrations, on life narratives of second and third generation of the Jewish and Nazi sons and grandsons. And then he started implementing this method of narration to the Israel and Palestinians. So I was actually participating in a workshop that lasted an entire 2 semesters, using life stories. Each of the participants had to tell his or her life story and see where we can connect. So as you can understand, that was very energy consuming process that obviously political agreement cannot based upon, if we try to implement it nationally. But the best answer I can give to your question is the two are probably parallel, probably go step by step with each other. And I agree with Noor that the mistrust and the skepticism from the current talks or Kerry efforts, there are always those buzzwords. Now it's the Kerry efforts. That is something that is common to both peoples that I totally agree are almost always smarter than the leaders. And Israeli society is very, very segregated, not just from the Palestinians in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, but also within itself. And I'm pretty sure that this segregation is something that we will have to break out of proceeding forward, because surely the narrative has to come into the conversation. We cannot detach them. It's true inside the Jewish Israeli society. We have a huge group that is called Mizrahi Jews, who are Jews who immigrated to Israel from Arab countries, that might be a missing link, you know, between the Middle East and Israel, being based on European Western ideas by the Zionist movement. So I'm just saying there are many options, and at this point I'm pretty sure that without even touching them, it would be very hard to enforce a top-down political solution without having the hearts and minds of the people on the ground.
Before we open the discussion, just very briefly, Noor, maybe you can say something to that.
Well, I just want to point out that if you look at the opinion polls, you still have a very large, almost absolute majority of Palestinians who want to implement the two-state formula. And Israelis, yes. Does that mean that we have to start out with the narratives? I'm not sure that the order you put is correct, and I'll tell you why. There's a very big difference between discussing the issue of the Holocaust as it relates to Jewish consciousness and history and Nakba, where Nakba is the dispossession of the entire Palestinian people, of the vast majority of the Palestinians. The actors of that Nakba now coexist on historical Palestine, whereas the Holocaust, as tragic as it was, and as big an imprint as it left on the consciousness of Jews worldwide, had nothing to do with Palestinian history. And there was no Palestinian participation. In that sense, equating them as prerequisites to a conversation about coexistence, I think, is complicating the matter. However, I do think that we need to come to terms with our shared history, and that shared history starts with the beginning of the last century, and it reaches that epic peak of the Nakba in 1948. If we can come to terms with that and call it what it is, instead of making a discussion about it illegal, as it is right now, then maybe, yes, we have a positive place forward to move on to. But I don't think that the situation is as dark as it may be portrayed about the denial and so on, at least on the Palestinian side, especially those who lived pre-Nakba. Someone like Claudette Habash, who was the fourth most influential woman in the Catholic Church up until recently, a Palestinian refugee from West Jerusalem. She still remembers the Jewish girl that she used to play with, whose parents had rented their guest house in Jerusalem. Now that girl lives in her house and she's a refugee. What I'm saying is there is that shared history. It needs to be recognized with all its pain. But that's where it starts. It doesn't start anywhere or any time before that, I think.
Wir sind jetzt schon spät dran, wir haben ein bisschen spät angefangen. Jetzt würde ich aber gerne die Fragen ans Publikum weitergeben. Ich bin sicher, es gibt viele Fragen. Die ganze Sache ist so komplex, dass man natürlich an so einem Abend gar nicht alles abdecken kann. Aber vielleicht können wir jetzt einiges noch in der Diskussion erledigen. Ich bitte Sie, der Herr.
I'm Michael Kochen, and I'm a German and a Jew. And I take issue with this discussion taking place in Berlin. Now, coming back to the foundation of the State of Israel, it's my hypothesis that the Zionist movement would have been a minority movement without the Holocaust. The Holocaust was instrumental, in my mind, in creating the United States decision of creating an Arab and a Jewish part of Palestine. Now, what is your opinion about a future role of the German government, who is until now purely pro-Israel in this conflict? Could that be a future role for this government?
You were asking Nur, Ode, or?
One by one?
Yeah, okay, Moin would like to. Okay, we collect, wir sammeln erstmal ein paar Fragen. This is yours.
My question goes to Tamara Sandberg. You told us about the impression you got from the Tel Aviv social movement, and you said us that it was maybe the beginning of the new left in Israel, or the increase again of the new left. My question is, can you explain why, as I was told by my Israeli friends and also by people like Uri Avneri, none of the people on the streets ever mentioned the word occupation, although it is now clear that the problems, social problems, and the costs of social life in Israel is very much influenced by the occupation.
Thank you. I must say I'm quite confused because I heard profound differences from the people on the podium on the question of the Oslo agreements, on the question of the developments inside the Israeli society, and on the question of the Palestinian leadership. So my question would be, is there or is there not anything positive from the Oslo Accords that can be taken in today's reality to get from here to an end of Israeli occupation? Second, is there or is there not a development in Israeli society that points to an increased willingness to give up the occupation? And third of all, does the Palestinian leadership or does it not have a coherent strategy with which it acts, or does it just react without a strategy?
Sollen wir die jetzt erstmal beantworten? Yes, okay. I think you were first.
Well, in response to your question, it's my understanding that before the Second World War, the majority of Europe's Jews were either Orthodox religious or affiliated with some of the anti-Zionist, socialist, or communist movements, and that one of the consequences of the Holocaust was that the vast majority of this population was simply wiped out, and that also helps explain the growing dominance of Zionism within Jewish Europe, let's say. Now, in response to your question, I mean, it would be nice to be idealistic, but we do have a reality when it comes to Germany and the role it can play with respect to this conflict. So I think at a certain level, I mean, it would be nice to say, well, Germany is the most powerful and influential member of the EU, and it, has moral obligations to do this, that, and the other. But I think if one wants to be realistic, one has to recognize that there are always, or at least during our lifetimes, going to be limitations on the role that Germany will be prepared to play with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, unfortunate as that may be. My response to your question would be to say that I think there has been a shift, perhaps even a significant shift in German policy in the last decade or two. Germany, in the European context, was always an obstacle obstructing the further development of a common European position on this conflict. I don't believe that's any longer the case. Germany may not be a leader in staking out a position, but it appears to be no longer being an obstacle. So I think perhaps the most important aspect of German policy is in the European context, and there I no longer see it as being an obstacle. And then if you talk about Germany in terms of its own government, well, during the recent General Assembly vote on Palestinian statehood, Germany abstained. I mean, I think, for Germany and the way it perceives itself and its special relationship with Israel and so on, I think it's a very significant development that I wouldn't minimize. Also, because it sends a signal, I think, to a lot of other countries, maybe not the Czechs and the Bulgarians, but to others. Now, in terms of the question about Oslo, yes, there are differences, and perhaps exposing and discussing those differences was part of the objective of the discussion tonight. My view is no, I don't see anything positive coming out, and what I would hope is that the Palestinians will begin to disengage from Oslo and, as an alternative, pursue the internationalization of the question of Palestine rather than bilateral negotiations under American sponsorship and supervision in order to achieve their fundamental rights in accordance with the international consensus on this issue.
Let me start with your question, and with your permission, I will start with the second part of your question about the cost of occupation. I want to tell you something. I'm not sure that ending the occupation would free all those money that the cost of occupation allegedly relates to. I don't know if ending the occupation would not lead to increase in the security expenses of Israel. It's not necessarily that the occupation cost Israel so much money, then ending it would suddenly bring social relief. I don't know that. In Israel, there is a tendency to everything that happens in our region only increases security expenses. There's dictatorship in Egypt, we have to be fully prepared. There's a revolution, democracy in Egypt, we need to be even more prepared. Even security expenses go up. Change regimes in Syria, security expenses go up. I don't know if a Palestinian statehood wouldn't increase security expenses, but you know what? That's not the reason why I support the Palestinian statehood and the end of Israeli occupation, because I believe not only it's the moral and the right thing to do, I also believe, coming from a left-wing agenda, and that relates to the first part of your question, that it's all part of the same policy. We cannot be occupiers and ensure social justice for just Israelis or just Jewish people. That's not possible. We cannot ensure, and coming also from the feminist movement, there is no equality to women when there's no civil marriage, and we have people living under our occupation in the West Bank. So from my point of view, it's a thorough agenda and an entire policy that has to be implemented in order for our policies to govern. Now, you are right, and your friend Uri Avneri is totally right, that the protesters shouting the people demand social justice did not mention the word occupation. That is obviously true. Nevertheless, that protest is still the best chance of left-wing politics, activists, movements to go back not only to government, but first of all to updated discourse of what the issues are really about, and of understanding that there is actually a thorough agenda that needs to be put on the table, and have the Israeli public, and we live in a democracy, go to elections or go to demonstrations over the question, would you rather a nationalistic, neoliberal, conservative on civil issues policy, that is what the right wing has to offer, or you would rather end of occupation, civil rights, gay rights, social democrat, economic policy. These are the alternatives. And there is nothing that did a better service to the other alternative that I belong to than the social protest. And this is why it is so important. Just a brief comment on the Oslo Accords. From our perspective, the best thing the Oslo Accord was a change of paradigm when it was needed. And I described earlier the unfortunate outcomes or the failures, but I think that what we have to learn 20 years later is that we need a change of paradigm now. And we have the creative minds, the most creative minds of Israel led the Oslo Accord as a change of paradigm. And this is what is needed right now. And the role of Europe and Germany in specific, I said it before in the roundtable, from where I stand, the best thing, the Netanyahu government, I just described its role. What you must know is that there is an alternative political camp in Israel that is your ally on these ideas, and that you are not asking any of you to replace us or what the Israeli society has to bring out of its own capacities and forces. We do ask you to look at these camp, to look at the Israeli opposition. No, there is a growing Israeli camp who opposes the government's policy and empowering their politicization and their capacities.
Gilad, you wanted to answer too?
Do you want to go first? I want to recap on the social justice and this kind of revolution that Tamar mentioned. And at the very same time, in summer 2011, when the streets of Tel Aviv were full of hundreds of thousands of people who demonstrated for social justice, I criticized the protagonists of this revolution and the activists for not mentioning the very clear link between that and the settlements, between that and us being the occupiers of the territory that does not belong to us, and I see a very clear linkage between the two. I believe that there will not be any kind of real social justice in Israel, equality, and real human rights, education, welfare, just name it, without first disengaging from the Palestinians, with or without an agreement. So this, to me, is the condition for a more sound and healthy Israel. And there's no need, by the way, to relocate more than 500,000 Israeli settlers, only about 80,000 to 100,000. That's it. All the rest are part of the blocks of settlements that will be incorporated in the boundaries of Israel and will be compensated in swap of lands by Israeli lands that would be part and parcel of Palestine to be established. So it's not such a huge task to do that. We've absorbed throughout the years close to 4 million Jews who came from the diaspora. Only in the 90s, throughout 5 or 6 years, we absorbed 1 million Jews from what was the Soviet Union. And so 100,000 is not such a big task for Israel to absorb. I believe that, relating to your question, sir, Mr. Cohen, the Zionist movement did not start after the Shoah. It started at the end of the 19th century. And the Balfour Declaration that provided for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine came in 1917. So yes, the Shoah had something to do with it, but this was not the cause for Jews to return to Israel. And part of the...
I talked about the statehood of Israel would not have been possible without the Shoah. The Zionist movement would not have been succeeded. That is my thesis.
I beg to disagree with all due respect.
Sure.
I think that the self-determination of the Jewish people, as much as the self-determination of the Palestinian people, has a very strong connection to the biblical land of Israel, and that sooner or later it would have come to be finalized and crystallized in Israel. About the Oslo process, this is also something that we've discussed this morning during the roundtable. I think that the bottom line is that there's no replacement for the two-state solution, and that Oslo is still, despite all the imperfections that it has, and all the problematic structure of the Oslo process, is still much better than the alternative. And the alternative is either internationalization, which is a bad alternative because it kind of takes the tasks from the table that the two parties negotiate around to a completely different venue, and it gets out of control of the parties. I believe in negotiations, I believe in dialogue, I believe in a reconciliation process that starts from the education system, and instead of having these kind of camps that promote hatred towards Israelis and Jews and imperialists wherever in the Gaza Strip, let's change that discourse first. And have a solid education system towards reconciliation. This is a long process, but it has to start someday. And I don't think that there is a replacement for dialogue. We need to solidify it with a lot of complementary elements, such as the one that I've detailed: unilateral, constructive, conducive, partial agreements to pave the way towards the end of conflict. This is part of the Oslo process. This is not something else. Yes, we failed once, we failed twice, we failed 3 times. Well, you get up, you brush off the dust, and you continue, because we have a compass that is leading us towards the two-state solution, and we need to get there. The Oslo is the best I think, operational paradigm for that. Only one thing that needs to be changed, and that is, if you refer to the formula that served Oslo up until now, which is nothing is agreed until everything is agreed during the permanent status negotiations. This has to be changed into whatever is agreed or mutually coordinated should be immediately implemented. And that provides a more stable and safe kind of way towards getting closer to the two-state reality and eventually to the two-state solution.
Oder, you also wanted to say something, maybe shortly, and then we'll have 1 or 2 more questions. Sure. And then I think we'll done for today.
I think it's very important to talk about what is possible to do as far as Germany is concerned. I don't agree with Mu'in's assessment of reality, and I do think that public opinion in Germany and in Europe and worldwide is maturing. and is becoming more and more committed to the universality of the application of human rights and international law. We see that in opinion polls. We see that in the support of making choices about where you spend your money and how you spend it and what kind of positions you take to be in line with the principles that you hold close to the heart. And that applies to everything, including this conflict. So I think Europe has a very unique and very important position to take leadership in aligning its actions with its own legislation, which does not accept violations of international law. And in that sense, aligning its steps and where it invests into this journey seeking peace in the Middle East, where it counts, and that is to make sure that its money doesn't go into supporting the continued existence of violations of international law, which are the settlements. Settlements, whether they're blocks or outposts, whether they're classified by the Israeli government as illegal or illegal, they're all illegal under international law. According to the Rome Statute, in fact, they are all war crimes. So, you know, giving them nice names, calling them blocks and neighborhoods doesn't make them more acceptable. They're violations. If we start by considering them that and applying international law to them, then maybe we have a better chance at reaching a peace agreement. I'm not sure why there's a lot of confusion about having different views. That's why there is a conflict. And usually negotiations, yes, negotiations are not done between friends. They're done between enemies. Having said that, I understand Gilad's attachment to Oslo and to the Oslo process. You were part of it. I draw hope from the fact that the majority youth population in Palestine and the youthful population in Israel is not as attached to this failed process, which I do maintain is failed. And I think both sides are ready to have a different discussion based on different foundations, ones that do not accept the status quo as inevitable, that they don't accept the presence of illegalities as fate. And here I go back to the settlements. I would love to see a reality where the majority of Israeli kids don't think of Palestinians and Arabs as dirty cheaters who live in tents and ride on camels. That would be great as well. But I don't think that's a prerequisite. I think that is an outcome of true peace, because at the end of the day, peace is not a package you buy at a supermarket. It's certainly not a reality you can dictate. And when you're in a position of power, as you are, as Israel, you can't put prerequisites to exercising an inalienable right of an entire people. And you say, you know what? I'm going to recognize your right so long as, A, you ensure my security, B, you recognize everything I want to be recognized as, C, you have to see me the way I see myself, and in so doing, maybe give up part of your narrative and history. It doesn't work like that. That's not a formula for justice. And without justice, there will be no peace. That is a certainty that I think we've all come to terms with. And it's a different launching pad for an entirely different conversation.
Yes, there would be a lot more to talk about. However, it's quite late. If there's one or two more very pressing questions, I would allow them. Otherwise, I would suggest that we call it a day, because the topic is very complex and there are not a lot of answers to all the questions we have. And I think we're all going home feeling more puzzled than before, maybe. But at least it was an attempt at actually presenting the different perspectives where you see that Palestinians agree or disagree among each other, and so do Israelis. And I hope that we will continue on a fruitful discourse, and that not this generation, maybe the younger generation finally will make peace. Thank you very much.